Now.
Great. So hey everyone, it's Sibei from DoraHacks. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of our space tech workshop series. We're super excited to have Jeff Krukin with us today. Jeff is the principal and co-founder at Earth Space Commerce Advisors. He will be sharing his knowledge and insights on current and emerging space markets for entrepreneurial ventures, touching on Starship's impact, commercial markets, and government markets, especially on the civil side. And I'm pretty sure all you space enthusiasts and entrepreneurial minds out there will have some awesome takeaways. But before we kickstart the session, I'd like to give you a quick introduction about who we are and what we have been working on to foster space innovation here at DoraHacks. So for those of you who don't know DoraHacks quite well enough yet, DoraHacks is a leading global hackathon organizer and developer incentive platform. We love to support innovation in space tech, quantum computing, blockchain, and many more other frontier tech fields. To date, we have supported 8 early-stage projects working within the space sector with our ongoing long-term space resources and exploration grant. So everyone contributing to the space sector is more than welcome to participate and receive support from us. And even more excitingly, in October, we launched another bigger initiative to further foster space innovation, which is our Starship Use Cases Hackathon with 100,000 US dollars in prizes. Considering the vast potential offered by Starship's lift capacity, we have developed 18 specific use cases and 2 open challenges for hackers to tackle. The use cases include orbital hotel, space farming, routers for global Internet of Things, metals from the moon, etc. And the 2 open challenges are novel satellite constellations and recreation facilities for space hotels. So through this hackathon, we like to motivate all space enthusiasts with engineering skills to build their solutions for space. So yeah, feel free to click the links below in the description. There you will find more details about our grant and hackathon programs. So both submission portals are open. So feel free to join us now, and we can't wait to review all your submissions and provide our support for your projects. Lastly, for the audience, during the workshop, please feel free to share any questions you have in the YouTube chat room, and I will definitely make sure to ask Jeff your questions at the end. Now, without further ado, I'm excited to pass the mic to Jeff. Welcome, Jeff, and thanks so much for joining us today. Why don't you kick it off by giving us a brief introduction about yourself before we dive into the workshop content?
Sure. No, thank you very much, Abe. It's good to see you again. And thank you for reaching out to me when you did about DoraHacks. Was not familiar. I had heard of the organization, but did not realize that you were moving into supporting space entrepreneurs. And I'm delighted that you're doing that because it's been great to see all around the world more organizations coming forward, recognizing the value of space startups and working to support space entrepreneurs. So I'm really glad to be a part of this effort. Um, I just add as far as to what you had said when you introduced me. So you mentioned my boutique consulting firm, which I co-founded. I'm also VP of Business Growth for a startup called Orbital Transports, which is headquartered in Chicago. I've been working with them since 2019. And then, in my consulting business, I've been working with a variety of startups as well as more established companies, all around the world. I've been mentoring entrepreneurs in the space community for over a dozen years through a new space business plan competition, Sharks in Space, as well. So that's something that I also enjoy doing. In fact, just finished working with 2 startups that were part of the U.S. entity Generation Space of the UK's Seraphim Space VC organization that has been doing space startup accelerators for some time. So that's a lot of fun. Really delighted to be here, and let's go ahead and get going. And
Yeah,
thank you,
sounds
everyone, by
awesome.
the way. Thank you, everyone who's out there watching and listening. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks to all the audience for tuning in, and I'm excited to jump in into our topic today. So our topic today is to explore current and emerging space markets for entrepreneurial ventures. And firstly, since we are hosting the Starship Use Cases Hackathon, we'd really love to hear, Jeff, your insights on the impact of the development of Starship, even though it has not succeeded yet. Firstly, I'm wondering, in your opinion, how has the development of Starship by SpaceX influenced the landscape of space markets for entrepreneurs?
Sure. And I think it's a good way to start at a foundational level, the conversation we're going to have. I want to make a comment about Starship. If you read in the general press coverage, at least in the United States, I'm not so familiar with how it was covered around the world, but a lot of the coverage labels the two launches as failures because Starship didn't reach orbit. And I think it's important to understand that this is still an R&D phase. This is a research and development phase that is still ongoing with Starship. This is not yet an operational vehicle. And building and flying a vehicle of its complexity and capability is certainly not an easy task. Just like any other launch vehicle undergoes significant challenges during its development. So I really encourage anyone who thinks of the first two launches as failures to recognize that actually it was quite successful, each one, in terms of meeting some of the metrics for each of those given launches. The fact that the second one reached a higher altitude, that all of the Raptor engines ignited, which was and operated, which was not the case in the first launch. So there were definite success points of the first and second mission. So I wanted to say that because I think it's important to have that perception. So, but back to your question, fundamentally, anything that we're going to do in space, if you think about everything we do on Earth, right, when it comes to an economy, when it comes to commerce, it all depends on transportation, right? It depends on low cost, frequent, reliable, economically, and commercially viable transportation. And that is not going to be any different with how we operate getting from Earth to space and how we operate in space. There will need to be low cost, frequent, reliable, commercial transportation. And that fundamentally is what Starship is going to be about, as are other commercial launch vehicles like SpaceX's Falcon 9, for example, and what's coming with Blue Origin, their New Glenn. But again, back to focusing on Starship. So as I said, it's all about transportation. And if you think about it in that context, so how will this influence, as you asked, how will this influence the landscape of space markets for entrepreneurs? So look at Starship as a launch vehicle that there's a lot of expectations, a lot of anticipations around what Starship is going to provide. A decrease in launch costs per payload, right? An increase in launch cadence, the number of times Starship is going to fly. Uh, In-orbit refueling capability, and a much greater payload capacity, 100 to 150 tons. So if you take all these capabilities together and combine them, it starts to remove barriers to current markets in space like low Earth orbit and open new markets like cislunar space and then onward to the moon and beyond. And if you look at historical analogies, right, whether it's been the development of ground-based vehicles, automobiles, trucks, trains, and so forth, or you look at ships, or you look at aircraft, over the decades of the maturation of those technologies, of those capabilities, whatever the domain, air, sea, land, and it will happen in space, whatever the domain, what we have seen and will see in space is larger, more capable, more fuel efficient, lower cost, safer, more reliable forms of transportation. And that opens up all kinds of potential markets for entrepreneurs who look at that vehicle as a form of transportation and start to think about, well, okay, if it has larger payload capacity, then what can I, as a new startup, manufacture that can go into that Starship vehicle that would have been too big to fit in a Falcon or a Falcon 9, for example, or one of Rocket Lab's smaller Electron launch vehicles. So that greater size and that lower cost per payload, and we can go into some more specific examples as we proceed. But that's the big picture. That's the foundational way of looking at Starship. Is it will open up more opportunities for entrepreneurs who look at it from the perspective of a transportation capability.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Jeff, for sharing on that. And I totally agree with you in regards to how successful the second test flight of Starship is. Even though in a lot of headlines there are people saying that it's a failure, but I think the hot staging was successful, and the liftoff was successful, and definitely they have gained a lot of invaluable data to further help them improve the development of Starship. So yeah, let's move on to the second question. I think you touched upon a little bit on the opportunities, and the second question is actually what potential opportunities and challenges does the Starship project bring for entrepreneurs in the space industry? If you can elaborate more on that, it's going to be great.
Right. No, I'm happy to do that. And, as we proceed, and of course, you and I have been discussing what questions we'll be diving into, and subsequent questions are going to allow us to dive in even deeper into those types of opportunities. Well, I don't want to flip the coin here. Before turning to opportunities, I want to start with challenges because,
Yeah.
everybody, I mean, it's exciting to think about opportunities, especially if you're an entrepreneur. It's not as exciting to think about the challenges, the obstacles, the roadblocks, but that's the reality. And if you're going to be successful as an entrepreneur or in just about anything, basically business or otherwise, you really do need to think about, to be aware of the challenges, the roadblocks, and understand how you're going to adapt to those, how you're going to deal with those. So, a couple of the challenges that I was thinking about while preparing for this. So, and start with Europe. Let's start with Europe, right? Because this is a global industry and launch is globally significant, important to many economies. And, there was certainly concern in the European launch community when SpaceX first started demonstrating the frequent use of the frequent ability to return and reuse their boosters, right? That reusability, brand new capability, right? Now you've got Starship that poses another challenge to the European launch industry, and Europe is falling further behind in that commercial global launch race. I mean, now especially you look at Ariane 6, its first mission has been delayed to July of next year. So that is a challenge to Europe. And it's a challenge, frankly, to any nation that is looking to compete against SpaceX, right? So that's one challenge. Another specific to SpaceX and certainly relevant to Starship is SpaceX already has a near monopoly on launch. Uh, at a recent conference a couple of months ago in the U.S., I forget which one it was. There's so many now. There was a lot of discussions on one or two panels about how were the smaller launch vehicle companies, like Rocket Lab, for example, but others that are still developing smaller launch vehicles for small satellites. How are they going to be able to compete against the capability now of Falcon 9, and then even more so of the greater capacity of Starship payload capacity? How are the smaller launch vehicles designed to launch one or two small satellites going to compete with a Starship that can launch tens of satellites at one time? And there's concern about that. And again, SpaceX is already a near monopoly. So will Starship exacerbate that monopolistic control that SpaceX will have over the market? If it does, there's potential issues there for concern. One is, of course, if you're a company with a near monopoly, you have much greater control on cost, right? So that has a ripple effect down the line for anyone that wants to launch on Starship. But also, and especially relevant to entrepreneurs who might be looking to start a launch vehicle company at some point, although a lot of investors right now will say, please don't. We have enough of them. We have more than we need. But if SpaceX maintains a near monopoly, if Starship exacerbates that near monopoly, will that dampen investor enthusiasm for existing space launch startups? Because investors might feel like, what's the point? You can't compete. So that has a potential, that's a potential negative issue. That's a potential challenge that entrepreneurs need to be aware of. And if you're an entrepreneur developing a product that is going to launch into space, and if a near monopoly based on Starship and Falcon 9 maintains, then what does that do to the cost to your company of launching your payloads into space? So these are all downstream challenges. Uh, so how will current business models need to be modified, right? How will other launch vehicle companies compete? And then how will other startups, either existing ones or entrepreneurs out there looking at creating new startups, how will they potentially have to modify their business models that they already established, that they already developed, to establish a startup based on assumptions A, B, and C? How might those assumptions be proven false when Starship becomes operational on a regular basis? And what might that do to the business models of those companies? And then the last challenge I'll mention right now is certainly there's an anticipation that, like with Falcon 9 flying more and more frequently, the same thing will happen with Starship. And right now in the United States, the Federal Aviation Administration has an Office of Commercial Space Transportation, and that office is responsible for licensing the launch and return of space vehicles. And the FAA can barely keep up with the current demand. And there was another issue with payload return with a company called Varda that we'll get to a little bit later. So that's another challenge that entrepreneurs need to be aware of. So let's turn now to opportunities that Starship brings into the market. So I mentioned a couple of times the payload capacity of Starship and how much larger it is. So there is a company, and the name of it escapes me, and I couldn't find it in the few minutes I had to do some research. But there's a new satellite manufacturing startup, and their business model is based on Starship's large payload volume, which can carry larger satellites. And so those satellites that this company intends to manufacture, they would not have been able to have the business model that they do, create the company that they did, and without having Starship's large payload volume available to them. So their business model is based on Starship. So Starship is creating opportunities like that. That's one example. Another example, and I know we're not going to touch, a great deal on the military aspects of space in our discussion, but nevertheless, it's important to understand that in the United States, there's certainly an interest on the part of the U.S. military in the capabilities of Starship. But that military interest opens up entrepreneurial opportunities. And so it is important to be aware of those opportunities. Just like Space Force has created business opportunities for startups relevant to small sats and their uses in low Earth orbit. So it's important as an entrepreneur to be aware of where all your business opportunities coming from. A third opportunity that will be enhanced because of the capabilities of Starship is in-orbit manufacturing. So there's an acronym called ISAM, in-orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. But think about manufacturing in low Earth orbit. That is an emerging market. there are startups and investor money flowing for that. So if you're you're an entrepreneur and you're excited about starting a company and building some kind of a space factory, if you will, to manufacture, maybe it's pharmaceuticals, right? Some type of biologics. Maybe it's to manufacture some type of material to be used for in orbit manufacturing of structures, for example. Think additive manufacturing or 3D printing in orbit. Uh, so the larger volume that exists in Starship means whatever space factory you as a startup are building can be larger, can be more capable because it can fit into Starship, whereas it would not be able to fit into any currently existing launch vehicle, again, because Starship has greater volume. So that opens up more opportunities, new ways of thinking about how large a space factory can I build because I'll be able to fit it into Starship that I wouldn't be able to build otherwise. Another potential opportunity, another use case is Starship's upper stage being used as a habitable space station. So, it's being carried into orbit. It can be used to carry cargo, it can be used to carry crew. It can also be turned into a habitable space station. Um, and then the last opportunity I have on my list here, uh, anybody that has worked in the IT industry, and that's where I started. Anybody that's paying attention to that, and anyone that's paying attention, I think, more broadly to the commercial space industry, it also is frequently hearing the notion of X as a service, right? So satellites as a service, providing Earth observation data, for example, as a service to customers, to companies, right? Well, will there be a commercial market for large assembled space telescopes? Maybe space telescopes as a service, right? Company will decide to build a space telescope large enough it can be handled by Starship, and it will be a totally commercial operation. And they will lease the use of that space telescope, say, to universities, maybe astronomers around the world, for example, just as an example of a potential new opportunity that Starship might bring to the market. Space telescopes as a service. So I'll stop at that point, throwing a lot out there as far as challenges and opportunities.
Thanks so much, Jeff, for sharing so much of your insights on the opportunities and especially the challenges given by the Starship's heavy lift capacity. And I'd like to move on to the commercial markets for the next. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, what are the most promising commercial space markets for entrepreneurs today? You've listed some examples previously. Now I'd like to hear your thoughts on the most promising markets, in your opinion.
Right. And so I want to dig in a little bit more into ISAM, in space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. And then I'll go into some other promising commercial markets as well. So I want to mention two organizations that are based in the US, but have international members. One has been around, I think, for about 5 years. The other was just established within the last couple of months. But they are both intended to support the development of technologies, of capabilities, and markets that from the beginning are designed to support in space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. And then I'm going to talk about two companies as examples of companies, of startups that fall into that category of ISAM as a market. So the first organization is called, the acronym is CONFERS, CONFERS. And if people are interested, just Google that. It stands for the Consortium for Execution of Rendezvous and Servicing Operations. So think about that. If you are in space, you're doing in space servicing or assembly of structures, satellites, vehicles, manufacturing, you need to be able to rendezvous, dock, and service those vehicles, hence that organization, Consortium for Execution of Rendezvous and Servicing Operations. Now, this CONFERS was I think started about 5 years ago. I may be off by a year or two. It was initially funded. It was initially started and funded in the U.S. by DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, an arm of the Defense Department. But it is transitioning now to a commercial trade association, and that was always the intent, that DARPA would provide funding for a certain number of years, but then the organization would need to transition to being a self-funded, by the corporate members, and become a commercial trade association. And that takes effect in January. We just had a conference call yesterday or the day before with the conference leadership getting an update on that. And the purpose of conference is to do research, to develop and publish non-binding but consensus-derived, consensus of the members, technical and operations standards for servicing satellites in orbit and rendezvous and proximity operations. Again, all those things required for ISAM. So that organization is just one indication of the importance and the potential, the promise of ISAM as a commercial space market. The second organization, which was just formed within the last couple of months, is known as COSMIC. That's the acronym, COSMIC, stands for the Consortium for Space Mobility and ISAM Capability. So an acronym within an acronym. But think about space mobility, right? Anything you're going to do in orbit is going to require mobility, which is another way of saying transportation. So COSMIC is organized and managed by the Aerospace Corporation, which is headquartered in California. COSMIC was mandated to be established it was released in December of last year, the U.S. government's national ISAM implementation plan. And the purpose of it is to accelerate the universal adoption of ISAM capabilities. So it's not a technology developing arm, it's more educational and help define what capabilities need to be developed to promote and permit the universal adoption of ISAM capabilities, all of which will be vital to an in-space economy, an Earth space economy is the way I prefer to think of it. And it's funded by NASA, their Space Technology Mission Directorate. And as I said, it's managed by the Aerospace Corporation. So those are two organizations that I felt that was important to review here. So now let me talk about some other commercial markets and give some examples of other companies. So commercial space stations, ISS is nearing the end of its useful life. And there are several companies, I'll mention a few, based in the US. I'm not aware of those in other countries. Doesn't mean they don't exist. There may be other startups as well. But the few that I'll mention are Axiom, Starlab, Vast, and Gravitics. All looking to establish different types of space stations. Gravitics and I think Vast as well are looking to develop initially small stations that will rotate, so there will be gravity. But these are all intended to be commercial. And NASA is certainly looking to these companies and working with them in various ways to support them, because NASA wants there to be multiple commercial space stations. NASA and the partner nations that funded and built ISS are not looking to replace it with a government funded space station. So commercial space stations is a market worth paying attention to. Another is edge computing in space, and that's important from a hardware perspective, a software perspective. You think about the vast amounts of data being generated, and even more that's going to be generated by all these satellites in orbit. So the more compute power you can put in space, you can put aboard those satellites, pushing that computing power out to the edge of the network, hence the term edge computing in space. That is a promising commercial market. There is an organization called the Edge Computing in Space Alliance. Look for that and Google it, or look for it at LinkedIn. The company I work with, Orbital Transports, is one of the co-founders. So if you're interested in edge computing in space, look up that organization, reach out to the contact if you're interested in joining. There's no cost to join. Another commercial market, we're all familiar, I would imagine, anyone with a technical orientation with IoT, right? And Earth space IoT, right? Connecting all these devices, not only on the surface of the Earth and the oceans and the air, but in space as well. All tied in with machine learning and artificial intelligence and IoT connecting everything. Oh, that's going to move up into space. Another market, low Earth orbit. You've got all these satellites providing communications to each other back down to Earth. That's only going to increase. And so certainly there is a demand for integrating satellites with unmanned vehicles, air, sea, and land, integrating the communications, the exchange of data. Obviously, militaries have an interest in that, intelligence agencies, but there's a lot of commercial opportunity there as well to develop the hardware and software needed for that type of integration. Last example I'll give of a commercial market. So I mentioned earlier X as a service, and I gave an example of space telescopes as a service. So think about infrastructure as a service. That may not seem to make sense at first, because when we think of infrastructure, we think of something solid, hardware, right? A building, what have you. But a building is just a structure. The service it provides depends on who's the tenant of that building and what capabilities they provide to what market. So turning that idea to space, there was a startup recently spun out of Lockheed Martin called Crescent Space Services LLC. Recently announced its entry into the lunar infrastructure sector. So Crescent Space is a new commercial company launched by Lockheed Martin, and it will provide infrastructure as a service for lunar missions. So that can mean communications, energy, power generation on the moon, other kinds of infrastructure as a service. So if you're an entrepreneur in the space marketplace, you need to be thinking about not just orbit, but you need to be thinking about the moon. There will be commercial markets, there will be commercial opportunities that are lunar based. And if you're a young entrepreneur, right, well, that's going to happen in your young lifetime. And so you can certainly be a part of making that happen. So those are my answers to that question that you asked, Yubei, about some of the more promising commercial space markets for entrepreneurs today.
Yeah, like I've made a lot of notes. It's very insightful. And apart from the organizations and companies you mentioned, is there any other examples of successful startups that you like to mention that capitalized on commercial space markets, and what can we learn from their experiences?
Well, sure. I mean, there's certainly far too many to talk about now. Unlike 10 years ago, there were far fewer space startups. But I'll give a couple
Very
of
true.
examples that cover some different aspects of, what you would think of in terms of an in-orbit space economy and ultimately a Earth-Moon space economy. So Orbit Fab is developing in-space refueling technology. They have won in the last year and a half several significant government contracts, because there's certainly a lot of interest on the part of NASA and the part of the U.S. military in developing that capability. So that Orbit Fab is an example of a company that is well positioned in the emerging commercial market of in-space refueling. That is going to be a vital market for an in-space economy. I mentioned the company that I work with, Orbital Transports, and Orbital Transports exists to manage small sat missions from concept to completion. So, every company that needs a satellite mission, that wants to do something with a satellite that is useful to its business, doesn't necessarily want to build its own satellite or even operate its own satellite or even buy a satellite, and not necessarily has the expertise to determine where they should buy the components that go into making that satellite. So That's something that a company like Orbital Transports has been doing since 2019. So, on a larger scale, certainly familiar with SpaceX, right? And so what have they been doing? ISS resupply missions, crew transport, reusable rockets. As I said, that's something new in the commercial sector, right? Uh, if you're an entrepreneur, there's a couple of ways to think about entering the market. You can repurpose a technology that currently exists, a capability, but do something moderately different or maybe better or lower cost, or come up with something completely new. I mentioned Axiom before as one of several commercial space station startups. Um, their approach is, at least initially, to start by using what exists as they build their own. So Axiom has already flown commercially several missions to the International Space Station as a way to get familiar with that process and start to train their own commercial astronauts or their customers to operate in the space station. Their first module that they're building will actually be initially attached to ISS, and then at some point, I believe the intent is to separate that and have it be its own freestanding commercial space station once ISS is decommissioned. A couple other examples. So, Earth observation, right, used to be something that just government agencies did with extremely large, extremely expensive satellites. In the US, think of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and their weather satellites. But now you have companies, many countries, Planet, Skyfi, ICI, providing different kinds of Earth observation capabilities, data sets, analysis, and so forth, serving different markets depending on what type of data they obtain and what they do. So those are some examples of just a very few of the huge variety of startups around the world that have capitalized on commercial space markets. I didn't even touch on, the over 120 launch startups around the world, most of which will not succeed because there's just not yet a market for that many. I didn't touch on all the propulsion companies that have developed and sell different kinds of propulsion systems for satellites. That's also a huge market in the commercial space sector.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, for mentioning all these startups and what we can learn from them. And lastly, in regards to commercial space markets, I'm wondering if you would like to share with us any tips in regards to how entrepreneurs can identify and tap into some niche segments within this commercial space markets.
Certainly. There is a huge amount of information out there now. Wasn't the case just 5, 6, 7 years ago. And there's a couple of different ways. I mean, so if you're an entrepreneur or you're thinking of becoming an entrepreneur, and again, you really want to get a sense of, all right, well, what segments should I be looking at right now that aren't overloaded, perhaps, right, with companies like the launch sector, how you learn about that. So, I've got four suggestions here. So the first one is monitor new technologies that bring new capabilities to commercial markets. An example of that is I talked about Earth observation, and there's a technology called SAR, which stands for synthetic aperture radar. It used to be very expensive to provide. Only governments could afford that with very large, very expensive satellites. But technology constantly evolves, becomes more capable, smaller, less expensive, less power intensive, can fit in smaller satellites. So there are now several commercial companies. I mentioned ICI, spelled ICEYE. I forget which European country it's headquartered in. That's a commercial provider of synthetic aperture radar Earth observation data, right? Satellite to cell phone communications, that is going to be a big market. So, as you're thinking of what to watch for, that's another area to pay attention to. right? That's an example of how evolving technology is creating new capabilities in space segments. So, second idea is, you'll see a lot of space entrepreneurs on their websites and their talks emphasizing that they are starting their companies not only because they're passionate about space exploration or human activity in space, but they see how space assets, space capabilities can be used to address problems here on Earth. So there is not a disconnect between what we do in space and how we live our lives on Earth. Actually, everything is fundamentally intertwined, even more so. So be attentive to Earth-based problems. I mean, we know what they are, whether it's pollution, forest fires, urban smog, right? But be attentive to Earth-based problems that can be addressed with space-based assets. The United Nations, I forget which agency within the UN, some years ago established, I want to say 17 or 15 sustainability goals that many nations around the world use as their guidelines to develop more sustainable living standards, economies, and so forth. Well, satellites, Earth observation data from Earth observation satellites are a tremendous tool that these countries are using to accomplish those sustainability goals. So again, be attentive to Earth-based problems that can be addressed with space-based assets, space-based technologies. That was number two. Number three, you want to track funding opportunities, right? If you're going to start a company, well, you want to know where you're going to get some initial funding support from, because you're not necessarily going to have a customer day one. So, depending on what country you're in, if there's a national space agency, defense agencies that need space assets, find out how they are supporting entrepreneurs, space entrepreneurs. What type of funding? What type of accelerators or incubators? Are there other government entities? For example, in the United States, there's the National Science Foundation that funds research in all kinds of scientific areas, including for space technologies. So pay attention to funding opportunities specific to your country. As I said, are there national space agencies? Are there national science and technology development agencies that are looking at space if there isn't an actually dedicated national space agency where you live? And then the fourth item I'll mention is there are wonderful reports available now, and I'll give two examples that come out on a quarterly basis from VC firms that are focused on supporting space startups. One is called Seraphim Space, based in the UK, and another is called Space Angels, based here in the US. Looking at where investor money is flowing and also where it isn't flowing compared to a couple of years prior will give you some good insight into what are some niche segments where investors see potential markets and are willing to invest their money. So those are four different ways that entrepreneurs can identify and tap into niche segments.
Very, very insightful. It's really good to know all these niche segments that entrepreneurs can consider to tap into the space sector. And now I like to move on to our last section during this talk. So I'm wondering, what are the key aspects of civil government space markets that entrepreneurs should be aware of?
And this will vary, of course, by country, right? Again, back to my comment about, do you live in a country that has a national space agency? And if not, some other government agency that does have funding, maybe incubators or accelerators, mentoring, and so forth to support space startups. In the United States, of course, we have NASA, we have NOAA, which I mentioned before, we have the National Science Foundation, which provide different kinds of funding through different mechanisms. I'm not going to go into all the details. And then you have the Defense Department, various entities as well in the United States, and certainly in other countries also. India has the International Space Research Organization. India is particularly worth paying attention to because earlier this year, ISRO, Indian Space Research Organization, released its plan its strategy for supporting space startups in that country, right? So if you're living in India, you want to be a space entrepreneur, you need to look into that. Find out how the Indian government is making support available to space startups. The United Arab Emirates, the UAE, they have the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center. And so there's certainly, if you live there, for example, all right, that's an example of a government program or agency. In Europe, there are many. Obviously, there's the European Space Agency. If you live in a country that has a national space agency that's a member of the European Space Agency, but there are other types of support depending on the country where you live. In France, there's the Aerospace Valley. I don't remember what part of France that's located in, but it is an area where there are aerospace companies and I believe support for space startups. A really cool example is Italy. Just saw a report, I don't know, a week or two ago talking about space startups in Italy. And just last week, the Embassy of Italy in Washington, D.C., working in collaboration with the Italian Trade Agency of Houston and the Italian Space Agency and its institutional and commercial partners, had space days at the embassy, at the Italian embassy, right? So Italy is certainly focused on that. Poland is another great example. I had come across a report, a white paper a week or two ago that listed all the space companies in Poland, right? So it isn't hard to find that kind of information if you are just do your online searching. And then the United Kingdom has a space agency, right, looking to develop a commercial spaceport in Scotland, and to support the development of space startups as well in the UK. Last example I'm going to give, and I'm going to read something here. This was just recently announced by the Australian Space Agency, which has announced funding for 2 new projects that will see Australia further contribute to NASA's Moon to Mars architecture. So 2 companies in Australia, Extraterrestrial Power and VXB Aerospace, 2 startups, are funded as part of the Australian Moon to Mars Supply Chain Capability Improvement Grants, right? So there's funding. And that program supports Australian businesses with domestic or international supply chain opportunities by providing grant funds for building capacity, skills, and capabilities. The focus is on space. So I'll conclude my answer to this question by again saying, if you live in a country that has a national space agency, that's the first place you should look. Look at their website for funding and partnership opportunities focused on helping stand up startup space sector in that country.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think you've already touched upon the last question I like to ask. But is there anything else that you want to share the entrepreneurial minds in the audience for them to better tap into the space industry?
Well, there's so many more examples specific to each one that I gave. Something I didn't touch on is in the last 6, 7, 8 years, there's been just an explosion in the number of space conferences around the world, right? So maybe you live in a country that 2 or 3 years ago, there weren't any space conferences. So that's something else to be looking for. There's simply nothing better if you're thinking of starting a company or you recently have, right? You can't do it all on your own. There's nothing better than being able to sit down with somebody at a space conference and have face-to-face conversations about, I'm a young entrepreneur. I'm looking to start a company. Here's what I'm thinking would be a good market to focus on, or here's what I'm thinking is a good technology that needs further development, or whatever it is that you're thinking of doing. And if you can go to a conference and sit down and have conversations with people that have already done this, have already started companies, all right, or even that work in various government agencies, but they can tell you, yeah, our government agency has this project or this program to support space entrepreneurs. Here's a technology we're looking for entrepreneurs to develop. So the more of those conversations you can have in person, if not, there are so many online events going on like this, but not just one-on-one, but also there are many online conferences that are, half-day events or a couple of hours that are free, right? So it's not as easy to network, but you can still often learn a great deal. Also, you might find that, oh, hey, that's a speaker I'd like to get in touch with. I really like what that person had to say. Typically, you can find people on LinkedIn, try to connect with them. So create as much visibility for yourself as you can as you're starting this process of creating a startup company. That will help a great deal. You can't get enough help, enough feedback, because whatever great idea you have, you may be really great at the technology, but maybe not so great on the business side. You may be really great on the business side, but not so great with the technology. You may absolutely hate sales and business development, but yet if your company is going to survive, you're going to need to have somebody that knows how to do that. So you want to start meeting people that can complement the skills that you have as an entrepreneur and bring skills that you don't have to your team. So that's another reason to be doing that kind of outreach and networking is if you haven't established your leadership team for your startup, that's a great way to start looking for people that have the skills that you don't have. Because we're all wired differently up here. We all have different capabilities. There's all things we're great at and things that we're not really great at. So that's I guess the last comment I have about all that. And one thing I do want to mention before I forget, I talked about how you can typically find most people on LinkedIn in our community, in our industry, and I'm certainly there as well. If anybody that's watching wants to reach out to me on LinkedIn and send an invitation to connect, I want to make a very important point here, right? Don't just click connect, write a message, right? And that goes for any time you want to connect with anybody, because we all get more and more invitations to connect where the person doesn't take the time to say, here's why I'd like to connect. So if you send me an invitation to connect and you don't write a message, number one, I don't know that you saw me on DoraHacks and that's why you want to connect. I'd love to know that. But if the one sentence that I see about your profile in the invitation, if it doesn't clearly demonstrate that you work in the space community, you do something with space, I'm not going to accept your invitation. If I have no idea what you do, or it's like, well, you work in an industry that has nothing to do with space and you just clicked connect, I'm not going to accept your invitation. But if you saw me here, let me know that. And happy to accept those kind of invitations. But I really want to be clear about that because I would hate it for someone who saw me here, wants to connect. I see your invitation and you're in some industry that I don't see any relevance to space. I'm just going to ignore that invitation unless I know that this is where you saw me. So I wanted to make that comment before I forget. At this
Yeah,
point,
I was just about to mention that for the audience, if you guys have any follow-up questions or if you guys want to talk to Jeff, feel free to click the link in the description. There you can find Jeff's LinkedIn profile. Just please indicate who you are and what you are working on so Jeff knows the background. Yeah, so I think we're coming up closer to time here. Just one last question. It's a personal question from me.
Sure.
It's not on our question list. I'm just wondering, as we look into the future of space exploration, it's really exciting. I'm just wondering what trend is the most exciting thing for you? Like, what are you most excited about?
What I'm most excited about is the commercial activity that's going to start happening next year on the moon. NASA has a program, the acronym is CLPS, CLPS, Commercial Lunar something, I forget, where NASA has been funding several startups to put robotic payloads on the moon to test various technologies and develop technologies that will be necessary for establishing permanent lunar settlements on the moon. That's what I'm really excited about, is just to see what's going to happen over the next, what I expect to happen over the next 10 to 15 years as we develop a permanent presence on the moon, uh, in a combination of commercial and government. And, I'm so excited to see that happen. I grew up, I'm of that age that, a lot of my friends, we refer to ourselves as children of Apollo, and as in the Apollo program. That's what we grew up with. I remember as a child, when the teacher would bring a black and white TV into the classroom on a TV stand so we could watch, the liftoff and the splashdown. And I was so excited about that. That just stayed with me into adulthood. And I've always known I wanted to do something space related, had no idea what it was going to be. I knew I wasn't going to be an astronaut because it just wasn't good enough at math and engineering, to do that. But yet here I found a way to be a part of the space industry, the space community. And I'm thrilled to see where things are going commercially. And so again, as I said, it's the moon that really excites me. Sometimes and the moon is often referred to as the eighth continent because it's the closest thing in space to this planet, right? And given the vastness of space, it's extremely close, right? So to me, it makes sense that as we move out into the solar system, we start by developing, commercially viable, economically viable habitats and settlements on the moon, and we learn how to live in space, on another planet. And so I'm really excited to see all of that happen.
Same here. Thanks so much, Jeff, for sharing. Just before we wrap it up, I just want to say once again that our Starship use cases hackathon submission portal is already open. We have prepared a prize pool of 100,000 US dollars and thoughtfully designed 18 use cases and 2 open challenges for all hackers to tackle. We also have our Space Resources and Exploration Grant Program in place to support space innovators for the long term. We welcome everyone who has a passion for space to join us and shape the future of space exploration. If you want to learn more about us and our initiatives, please click the links in the description to our grant and hackathon pages. And we do have more space-related content in the pipeline for you. So make sure to follow us on YouTube and Twitter at DoraHacks, so you won't miss out on any updates. With that being said, I just want to say a huge thank you to Jeff once again for being here with us today and for giving us this very insightful talk. Really appreciate your time. And thank you to all the audience for tuning in today. We will see you soon. So have a good one there.
Take care, everyone. And thank you very much, Sabea. It was a pleasure. Totally enjoyed it.
Thanks, Jeff. See you soon. Bye-bye.